Hello, David.
Good morning. How are you, sir?
Good, and yourself?
We're doing well, thank you.
Thank God.
Doing all right.
Thank God. Yeah, and you've got square number one.
I guess I do. I guess I do. There we go. Well, you couldn't ask for better weather today.
Yeah, I haven't been out. Yeah,
It's-
I'm in the synagogue, but I was here by 9 o'clock. So,
Yeah. Oh, it's gorgeous out.
nice, nice, good. We like it. Our spring and our fall are lovely.
Chamber of Commerce weather, as my son would say.
That makes sense. Yes, indeed. All right. Anything exciting happening?
Not really. Not really. I've got Sears coming out today to repair a dishwasher. I can't tell you how much service I've had from that.
Oh God. Well, I
But
had
the last time he was here, he had to order parts, and then one of the parts was back ordered, and so it's been about a month since he was here last.
okay.
So hopefully after today we'll have it repaired since I've now got the parts.
That would be good. I'm dealing with, although I didn't have major issues with the freeze, my sprinkler system did burst. And so I haven't had a chance to get it fixed yet. But in the meantime, my water bill came in and I got a $350 water bill.
Wow. Did you get hit with a big electric bill too?
No, no, I did not.
Good. Ours went up very slightly, just about 20, 30 bucks. So that wasn't too bad.
Good morning, Rona.
Rona, how are you? So today is the last class of this course, is that correct?
That's right, right. In the fall, I'll probably pick up with a couple classes on the High Holiday Liturgy. I'll repeat a few that I did last year, and then we'll go into American Jewish history. And I've just started writing a course on rabbinic times.
Rabbinic times, okay.
Yeah. So
those should both be very interesting.
Yeah, so that'll take us through next year at least, if not into the following year.
And are you traveling during the summer or staying home?
I'll probably do a little bit of traveling, by car. I'm going to Phoenix in 2 weeks for my niece's, right after Passover. My niece is getting married. I'm doing that wedding.
Right.
Then after that, yeah, I will drive to Phoenix. My nephew his wife is having a baby in June, so I'll go out and visit there, and then I may just travel around the country a bit for a couple of weeks.
Very good.
Yeah. Nothing major. Visit some friends in Dallas I haven't seen in a very long time.
No.
And you?
No plans for the summer. Our grandson's bar mitzvah out in California will be in October, so that's our destination. October 25th, I think it is.
So in California, out in yeah.
In Irvine, yes.
Yeah. I know the Mishpacha, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Very cool. Morning, Bob. I know Jerry's there somewhere.
I'll just say good morning as usual. I'm up really late.
Yes, good morning.
So
Hello,
I'm still eating brunch. But I did get an exercise class in, so it's not
There you go.
first thing this morning. Are you gonna continue to do a lot of Zoom things or just play it by ear in the fall?
Oh, no, it'll probably be on. We're getting a much better attendance on Zoom. It seems to be much easier.
It is.
And so
great.
I don't see any reason to change it. It also enables people from all over to join.
Yeah, I like that too, that people from other places that you know or who hear about it can come.
That's
So-
right. I have, members of family members of congregants who have been joining us. The rabbi's wife's parents have been with us on Sunday mornings. I've got people from my former congregations. Naomi Baranchik joins us on Sundays from Toronto.
So that's great. I like it. I mean, it's great to be in person, but in some ways this is easier because you could be doing stuff at home and then just sign on.
Yeah.
And not have to worry about getting there on time.
I do think this is probably the new model of adult education all over the place.
And even for some organizations.
Yeah.
Because I know we're going to do the Women's Caucus for Art board meetings this way, for sure. Even if we do some in present, they'll be always connected so people can.
And corporations. My nephew works for Boeing. And they are figuring out how to enable people to work at home because it's cost effective.
Yeah. My son's been working at home for a while. He used to go in occasionally, but ever since he became a full software engineer for Fidelity, most of it's at home because the team's in other places and they have to, they're not connecting that way anyway. So.
Right. All right. I've got 12:02 official Zoom time.
Gonna mute.
Okay. All right. Good afternoon. Good morning. Welcome to our final class for this class. The bad news is that anti-Semitism continues. It doesn't end with our class. So, but nonetheless, this is meant to be a history, not a current events class. So we'll have to take that up in 20 years. You'll come back and we'll do this again. All right. The Cold War was a 46-year-old standoff between superpowers, United States and Russia. It began at the end of World War II and continued until 1991 when the Soviet Union's communist government collapsed. It was a time of heightened nationalism. And in the 50s and 60s, what we saw was all the great empires built by the European nations were crumbling. And so what you had was these two superpowers trying to bring those new developing nations into its sphere of influence. The competition in particular in the Middle East turned into a major battlefield of the Cold War, and anti-Semitism was increasingly used as a weapon in that battle. Before World War II, Europe had been home to most of the world's Jews. By 1950, just 5 years after the Holocaust ended, the United States now had the world's largest Jewish population, between 4 and 4.5 million. The Soviet Union ranked second, despite the fact that half of the approximately 3 million Jews who had lived there in 1939 had been killed. They still ranked second in the world. American Jews essentially during that time had been relatively safe from the genocide, but as we described last week, many of them did not necessarily feel safe. By the 1950s, however, that attitude towards Jews in America was changing. More and more Americans viewed Jews in a positive way. And as a result, we saw anti-Semitism, Semitic violence drop sharply. And historians have essentially attributed that shift to a growing prosperity in the US in the post-war years. Many Americans were feeling more confident about the future and therefore less fearful of minorities, including Jews. A second factor that played into it is that thousands of GIs who had experienced discrimination in the American Armed Forces during the war returned home far less willing to tolerate the traditional dehumanizing ethnic snobberies of the pre-war years. And so, as you know, clearly economics, we've talked about economics. When things are good, things were good. It's that simple. When things are bad, you see what happens. During the war years, anti-Semitism also increased in the Soviet Union, but it did not decline following the war. When Soviet Jews turned to the government for protection, officials refused to help. Instead, they actually accused the victims of unleashing Jewish nationalism. And the Soviet Jews were shocked by this charge. After all, during the war, they had shown great loyalty. About 500,000 Jews served in the Soviet army. 200,000 died in battle. More than 170,000 were awarded medals for their service. You have a sense of Jewish involvement. And nonetheless, once Joseph Stalin questioned the loyalty of the Jews, the government workers were free to treat them as unwanted outsiders. In such a brutal dictatorship, attacks on a group were allowed to continue only if they had the support of the nation's leader. In this case, they had Stalin's. Stalin considered what he called Jewish nationalism a crime. Stalin's support of Israel as a state did not mean that he had changed his mind about Zionism or Zionists. It simply means that he saw an opportunity to undermine British and American influence in the Middle East. And so he could, at one and the same time, support Israel's right to exist and attack Jews within. Stalin was on the hunt for so-called Zionist traitors within Russia. Among the first to be attacked were members of what was known as the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, a group Stalin himself created during the war to improve the image of the Soviet Union and raise money from abroad. This committee was a success, but its members quickly learned that the more successful they were, the more certain Stalin was of their disloyalty. The fact that they were devoted communists made no difference. And as a general rule, this group had no ties to Judaism as a religion. Nonetheless, they had been deeply affected by the mass murders that had happened within the Soviet Union in places such as Babi Yar. And the group documented those murders by gathering witness accounts in the hope of bringing to justice those who were responsible for those kinds of attacks. And they were collected and put into a volume known as the Black Book. But the Black Book was not the only reason that these committee members found themselves in trouble with Stalin. Some of its members wanted to turn Crimea into a Jewish autonomous republic, a place where Soviet Jews could live without fear of anti-Semitism. Khrushchev, who headed the Ukrainian Communist Party in 1948, describes Stalin's reaction. And that's reading number one. David, you've got it.
He had committee members arrested arbitrarily and without any regard for legal norms, regardless of the important and positive role which the accused had played during the war in helping to bring to light the atrocities committed by the Germans. Theirs had been constructive work, but now it counted for nothing. Stalin could have simply rejected their suggestion and rebuked them, but no, he had to destroy all those who actively supported the proposal.
In January of 1948, Stalin began the process of destroying this Jewish anti-fascist committee, which he had organized, by ordering the accidental death, quote unquote, of its chairman. And one by one, other members were executed or shipped to forced labor camps in Siberia on Stalin's orders. In 1955, 2 years after Stalin's death, the Supreme Court of the USSR concluded that the case against the committee members was falsified, and they repealed the sentences posthumously because, quote, there was no substance to the charges against them. Stalin's campaign against the Jews focused primarily on Jews who expressed themselves in Yiddish, which was the great majority, and used Jewish themes within their work. These artists were accused of being rootless cosmopolitans, unpatriotic people with no attachment to their homeland. Many lost their jobs or were expelled from the Communist Party, while others were imprisoned. About the same time that this was going on, a number of even more unlikely Zionist traitors were put on trial. The government workers, government officials of Jewish descent in the Soviet bloc. Hundreds were demoted or fired. Others tried for treason. Among the accused was Rudolf Slansky, the former Secretary General of Czechoslovakia's Communist Party. Throughout the trial, the prosecutors referred to Slansky and the 10 other Jewish defendants as swine. And as proof of their treachery, prosecutors revealed that the accusers had sold arms to Israel in 1948. And they did, indeed, provide weapons to Israel. But what the government failed to acknowledge was that Stalin had approved the sale. All were found guilty of treason and sentenced to death. According to the New York Times, the proceedings were a show trial, a trial whose outcome was determined in advance. Many in the Soviet Union believed that after that trial, all Jews were going to be shipped to Siberia for security reasons. But before that happened, Stalin suddenly died. In 1956, Khrushchev, who had become the leader of the Soviet Union, denounced Stalin at a party meeting. But anti-Semitism nonetheless was not on the list of crimes that he attributed to the former leader. Khrushchev and his successors were not as hostile to Jews as Stalin was, but they were just as willing to use Jews as scapegoats when the situation called for it. So we know Soviet Union took over a lot of Poland, and in process, they exported the anti-Semitism to Poland and other satellite countries. All right, there was a lot of Judeophobia throughout, and so it was easy to do so. The Polish Jewish population of the 1930s of 3.5 million had fallen to 150,000 after World War II. So we had 150,000 total left at this point. But that decline did not terminate Polish anti-Semitism. Even after the war, pogroms took place in Kielce and Krakow, and in 1969, an anti-Zionist campaign effected a purge of many Jews in the universities and from the economic and political life of the country. The campaign was blamed on a student strike of the year before, supposedly staged by Zionists. There were, at that time, when this happened, only 25,000 Jews in the entire country, of which 15,000 emigrated that year, so you had 10,000 left. But that's not the end of it. By 1981, with only 5 to 7,000 Jews left, in Poland, there was a public demonstration, apparently officially coordinated, which was staged against the Zionist clique that supposedly was directing solidarity and influencing the government. Another case of anti-Semitism without Jews in a Jew-free country. Czechoslovakia, an heir to a long, relatively moderate tradition, and after a serious but fatal flirtation with liberalism, was unable to resist Soviet anti-Semitism importation. In the wake of the Six-Day War, an anti-Semitic wave rolled over the entire country of Czechoslovakia that was soon to be described as a national plague. Many leading Jews had to leave the country, and while only a handful of Jews remained in the country, vocal anti-Semitism continues. Anti-Semitism without Jews. Following the Six-Day War, the Soviet anti-Semitic propaganda using Nazi-like caricatures increasingly demonized the Jewish people, condemning Zionism as fascist and racist. Judaism was seen as a wicked religion, Jews as criminals and conspiratorial people. This is where the equation of Jews and Nazism became a common theme. The Zionists were understood as the ones who taught Hitler how to be cruel. It took until October of '91 before Gorbachev denounced anti-Semitism, the first time in history that a Russian leader had done so. And he put an end to the official anti-Semitism, but a new freedom under Glasnost saw the new appearance of many anti-Semitic publications and parties, no longer government-sponsored, but just as powerful. In spite of all the dissident movements and the struggle for human rights, anti-Semitism remains deeply rooted in Russia and in the former Soviet republics. Okay. In the late 50s and 60s, a movement arose among Soviet Jews to reclaim their identity. In many places, that movement was inspired by the need to remember the loved ones who had been lost in the Holocaust. Some Jews put up small memorials at places where their relatives had been murdered. And each year, people would gather and mourn and remember. From the start, however, Soviet officials viewed these gatherings as disloyal, and they insisted that Jews put the past behind them. Holocaust survivors in other nations had similar experiences. However, a growing number of survivors were finding it difficult, clearly, to just move on with their lives without confronting the past, without remembering their loved ones. And some perpetrators and bystanders were also feeling the need to face not only the Holocaust, but centuries and centuries of anti-Semitism. In America, most young American Jews in the 60s, and I have to tell you, I was one of them, knew very little about the Holocaust. Brooks Sussman, who would later become a rabbi, told an interviewer, reading number 2, Rona, do it on mute.
Oops, I got to pull the reading in front of me.
Okay.
It's short. My parents hid it from us. They didn't want us to be injured or brutalized by it. We went to war. We beat Hitler. It can never happen again. You don't need to know about it.
His parents weren't alone. Many Jews in the years after the Holocaust were reluctant to discuss the genocide with their children. I knew I had lost people in World War II. But imagine my shock in high school when I'm sitting in a class with my rabbi and he starts describing the Holocaust and I have no idea what the term means. None. My parents were born in the 30s. They knew what was going on.
Can I answer something?
What's that? Yeah.
Having been a son of Holocaust survivors myself, I got what you're saying about the survivors being reluctant to speak. Mm-hmm. I can tell you also that the younger generation also was discouraging them, was telling them enough of that, get on with life. In Israel, that was the same thing. In the US, in Romania, where I'm from, in Czech Republic, where my wife is from, the younger generation basically told the parents, get on with it, and didn't really want to hear it also. There's both sides of it.
Right. It doesn't surprise me because younger generations, I know what my reaction to Yiddish was growing up, and I'm so upset with myself for not having grasped it. Yeah, younger generations do that in general, but all the more so when it's such a negative impact on life. Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
But you know, in my both my parents were in the States by the time of World War II. Well, my father was an immigrant. My mother was born
so
in the
were my
States.
parents,
but,
grandparents.
But they didn't talk about it either, particularly. And I know my mother, you know, to many Jews of that generation, Roosevelt was a hero, and there was no knowledge that about, you know, or acknowledgement that there was all that politics to keep the immigrants, the people trying to get out of Germany out that we know about now. So no, there was nothing of that. And to tell you the truth, my father didn't even talk about how he got out of, when he immigrated.
All right, I don't want to go into that story. I want to,
No, no, I know, but
be brief, be brief. Go ahead.
It's always the we don't want to deal with that.
Absolutely, absolutely. I apologize, but I've got a lot to go here. Okay, so clues were everywhere, though, and young Jews suddenly found themselves more aware of the Holocaust, and some formed study groups at synagogues and community centers to deepen their knowledge. Louis Rosenblum, a NASA scientist in Cleveland, Ohio, attended one of these groups, and by the time the course ended, he and his classmates were convinced that their parents' generation had not done enough to save European Jewry, and they were determined not to make the same mistake and decided to find out where Jews were still at risk, and they quickly focused on the plight of the Jews in the Soviet Union. And you ended up with groups like the Student Struggle for Soviet Jewry, etc. All right. Egypt. Anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism. Jews in Arab countries were seen as potential traitors. In Arab nations, many people opposed Zionism because they believed that the UN had no right to establish a Jewish state on what they considered to be Arab land. They also saw the Zionist claim to Israel as nothing more than a continuation of Western domination. And for some, anti-Zionism was increasingly rooted in a belief that God had given the Muslims ownership and responsibility for all of the Middle East. And the fact that Arabs had reasons for, nonetheless, the fact that Arabs had reasons for opposing anti-Zionism didn't mean that their opposition was free of anti-Semitism. That was there as well. November 2nd, 1945. The anniversary of the Balfour Declaration, Hassan al-Banna, the head of the Muslim Brotherhood, gave a fiery speech at a rally in Cairo. And soon after, violence breaks out as angry protesters go on a rampage in the Jewish neighborhoods. Why does anger at a declaration issued in 1917 result in an attack on Egyptian Jews 28 years later? Perhaps it's because the British had power and the Egyptian Jews did not. It's easier to attack the Jews who are perceived as the associates of the British. The Brotherhood believed that the European ways had corrupted Egyptians and degraded Egyptian society. Members called for a jihad to restore Egypt to God's rule. The enemy in the struggle were the Jews, according to the Brotherhood. In the view of their leadership, they had been the enemies of the Muslim community since the first day. He stated, reading number 3, and Bob, you've got the third square.
The bitter war which the Jews launched against Islam is a war which has not been extinguished, even for one moment, for close on 14 centuries, and which continues until this moment. Its blaze raging in all corners of the earth.
What's an approximate date of that, please?
Are
Are we in the 1950s or?
Give me a second.
Okay.
I don't have that here.
Okay,
I don't
that's
have it.
fine. That's fine.
What's the origin of this quote?
The name of the individual, I don't know how to say, is Saeed, and the last name is Qutb. I didn't even try to pronounce it. I just referred to him as the leader. I'm going to call him Q. All right. What's that?
Is this the one from Egypt in 1945?
Oh, yeah, you're right. That is right. That's correct.
1945?
Thank you. I just didn't turn the page back enough. All
That's
right.
Hassan Albani.
Qutb is his last name. All right, the war to
I
which
know who he is. You can just call him QAnon.
that's right. Oh wow. So the war that he's referring to here in this 1945 document is the conflict that resulted from the refusal of Jewish tribes in Medina to accept Islam in the 600s. All right, a little bit of history. In 1945, however, few Egyptians really supported these ideas. Indeed, a number of Egyptians tried to protect the Jews from the rioters. King Farouk and other officials expressed sympathy for the victims and offered to rebuild a synagogue burned in the riots. But his prime minister, al-Nugrashi, claimed that all Jews were potential Zionists and potential traitors. He ordered every Jewish organization provide the names and addresses of its members. And the Muslim Brotherhood went further by calling for a boycott of all Jewish businesses. Others went a step further, setting off a bomb in Cairo that killed 22 Jews and wounded 41 more. As more bombings take place over the next few months, the prime minister confronted the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, by the way, he was not pro. We had been anti to begin with, but he still confronts them for the violence. He banned the group, and the Muslim Brotherhood retaliated by assassinating him. In response, the government agents under the king's rule killed al-Banna, the group's leader. Nonetheless, soon after Egypt signed a formal ceasefire agreement with Israel in 1949, about 20,000 Jews, 25% of the Egyptian population, emigrated. Clearly, some of them were Zionists, but the reality of it is the great majority of them had been living, their families had been living there for generations and generations and generations, and regarded it as a place, a home, but a place where they could no longer earn a
I'll
living.
certainly call you when I get the parts for my treadmill. Thank you.
Okay.
I'm
July
sorry,
19th.
what year was that? When
That-
was that?
That was 49.
Thank you.
3 years later, 52, a revolution that King Farouk and his supporters had long feared came along. It was led by a group known as the Free Officers, nearly all of whose members had fought in the 48 war against Israel. They blamed the king and his advisors for the losses that had taken place. These Free Officers declared Egypt a republic, and Mohammed Naguib, Naguib, as its first president. In 54, he was then ousted by Nasser. Nasser also wanted Egypt to become a socialist state, much like the Soviet Union, in a sense, to nationalize hundreds of foreign-owned businesses. It's financially feasible, including the Suez Canal Company, whose stock owners were British and French. Almost immediately, what does he do? He closes the canals to ships going to and from Israel. Israel views this as an act of war. On October 29, Israel invades Egypt's Sinai Peninsula and pushes towards the Suez Canal. 2 days later, Brant and Fritton join the invasion. Within days, the fighting ceases. During this Suez Canal crisis, Egyptian Jews were not harassed by the mobs as they had been in 1948. This time, instead, the threat came from the government, because the government no longer distinguished Zionists from other Jews. As Lucette Lanyado, an Egyptian Jew, explained, reading number 4, Marcia, you've got the fourth square. Marcia Citron.
Families who lived in Egypt for generations, whose children were born there and knew no other way of life, were escorted to the airport and, as squads of rifle-toting soldiers watched, put on planes bound for Europe.
So within a year, another 30,000 Jews were gone. You were left by 1967 with a whopping Jewish population of 4,000. Where were the protests against all the Jews who were treated that way? And I'll leave the rest of the political commentary for another time.
So what happened to all those Jews that that were just put on planes to Europe? Did the European countries accept them, or did they end up going to Israel anyway?
I would imagine it's a case by case basis. You're talking in 67?
I'm talking about what you just said about.
Yeah, in that's 67. I just want to make sure you're not talking about the post World War II.
No, 67.
In 67, it's probably a case by case basis. I'm sure, again, 30,000 is not a huge number. And so I'm sure many were accepted in Israel, and they're small enough numbers that most of them probably got in elsewhere because it wasn't like World War II DPs. By the early 60s, the Palestinians in Israel were tired of waiting and decided to take matters into their own hands by raiding Israeli settlements. Israel tries to convince the Arab leaders of the need to stop the violence after each raid. And initially, this strategy persuades Nasser of Egypt and Hussein of Jordan, because neither of them right now want another war. But the Soviet Union and Syria see the raids as an opportunity to expand their influence in the region. And so they provide the Palestinian group Fatah with money and with arms. And as the attacks continued, Israel clashed not only with Fatah, but along with the Syrians in the Golan Heights. And the Soviet Union continues to contribute to the high tensions by not only supplying arms and money, but by spreading false rumors that Israeli troops are gathering near the Syrian border. By May of that year, 67, Nasser is convinced that war is inevitable and begins making plans for the coming conflict. He closes the Straits of Tiran to ships going to and from Israel. He demands that the UN troops leave the Sinai Peninsula, and he stations troops along Egypt's border with Israel. Those acts convince the Israelis war is coming. On June 5th, the war begins, which is known as the Six-Day War. By the time the UN arranged a ceasefire on the 11th, Israel held Egypt's Sinai Peninsula, Jordan's West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Syria's Golan Heights. The leaders in Egypt, in Syria, and Iraq respond by expelling nearly every Jew in their borders. Again, I'm going to echo, where's the response? Where's the world's response? Not long after the war ends, a number of Arab they started making plans for the next war, the Yom Kippur War in 1973, a surprise attack on October 6th. Although Israel is caught unprepared in less than 3 weeks, its army had gained the initiative. And by October 26th, the UN imposed a ceasefire to prevent a regional war from escalating into a world war. The Muslims did something the Jews have done historically on this one. The Muslim Brotherhood saw the Arab defeat in the two wars as evidence that Arabs had strayed from the pure teachings of Islam. Jews have always seen their defeats as not enough Torah dedication. All right. Well, the Arabs took up our book, and they also, why did they lose? It was not enough commitment to Islam. Nasser agreed with this, and he once again aligned himself with the group, telling his followers that Almighty God wanted to give us a lesson. After his death in 1970, Sadat continued to support the radically conservative Islamic ideology that had marked Nasser's final years. The Middle East and North Africa were not the only places where these two wars had had an impact. Israel's victories shattered old stereotypes about the cowardliness of Jews. A fickle reversal of perspective turned Israel into Goliath in a confrontation with the pan-Arab world cast into the role of David. That's where we are today. That's how the world perceives it. According to one observer, anti-Zionism had become the third wave of anti-Semitism in the century, the first of which took place in the form of pogroms, the second, and the Dreyfus Affair, the second Nazism, and the third is this anti-Zionism. Reading in 1967, in a press conference, French President de Gaulle described Jews as, I think, yeah, this is reading number 5. I'm jumping ahead. So Ted, you've got the 5th box. I started to read it, so it's all yours.
In the 1967 press conference, French President Charles de Gaulle described Jews as an elite people, self-confident and domineering, and claimed that they were responsible for provoking ill will in certain countries and at certain times. In Britain, novelist Colin Macinnes observed, before the battle started, most Englishmen thought of Jews only as oppressed victims, little Israel surrounded by foes dedicated to its destruction. After their swift victory, the Jews seemed transformed into conquerors, even oppressors, and Arabs who were thought as arrogant attackers seemed to have become overnight the victims, the wronged, the weak.
And boy, have they learned to use that in their marketing. All right. Throughout the 70s, I'm going to switch. Again, I'm shifting gears a little bit. Soviet and Arab leaders falsely linked Zionism to racism and imperialism by arguing that Zionism was an imperialistic militant ideology of racial hatred, which should be universally condemned. That language in particular had a powerful impact on the nations that had only recently been under colonial rule and were still struggling with the consequences of those kinds of racisms and imperialisms. So they grouped the Israelis with the oppressors. Zionism was increasingly viewed as a huge, invisible power linked to American imperialism. And as a result, many of these new nations supported a 75 resolution backed by the Soviet Union and Arab nations that defined Zionism as a form of racism. The Israeli ambassador Chaim Herzog began his speech at the UN with reading number 6. Karen, if you have it, you've got reading number 6.
Zionism is to the Jewish people what the liberation movements of Africa and Asia have been to their own people. Historically, it is based on a unique and unbroken connection extending some 4,000 years between the people of the book and the land of the Bible. In modern times, in the late 19th century, spurred by the twin forces of anti-Semitic persecution and of nationalism, the Jewish people organized the Zionist movement in order to transform their dream into reality. Zionism is our attempt to build a society, imperfect though it may be, in which the visions of the prophets of Israel will be realized. I know that we have problems. I know that many disagree with our government's policies. Many in Israel too disagree from time to time with the government's policies and are free to do so because Zionism has created the first and only real democratic state in a part of the world that never really knew democracy and freedom of speech.
Again, that's Herzog's speech to the UN. In the end, as well, you know, the resolution in favor of labeling Zionism as racism passed. 72 votes in favor, 35 against, 32 nations abstaining. Jews in many places were immediately branded as racist worse than the Nazis, and anti-Zionism is incorporated into the UN documents. It took Israel and its allies, including America, 16 years to overturn that resolution. And if you realize what year, it's 1991, what's the parallel? They succeeded in part because of the collapse of the Soviet Union's communist government. of the United Nations, Alan Dershowitz, wrote, Martin, you've got reading square number 7.
The UN General Assembly even went so far as to encourage Palestinian terrorism against Israeli and Jewish civilians. In 1979, it approved an exception to the International Convention against the Taking of Hostages. The amendment, which expressly intended to permit hostage taking by Palestinians, went as follows. The present convention shall not apply to an act of hostage taking committed in the course of armed conflict in which people are fighting against colonial occupation and alien occupation and against racist regimes in the exercise of their right of self-determination.
So I guess that explains the 72 Olympics. I say there's a tongue in cheek here, please. No, that's right.
When was that written? In 91 or later?
Yeah. Again, I don't have that. The
Okay,
time.
not important.
My apologies.
But it also excused the massacre in Kiryat Shimona.
Right.
Occurred around that time.
Yep. So some will say, you hear this charge all the time, it's inappropriate to speak of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism in the same breath. You should be able to criticize the Israeli policy without running the risk of being accused of being an anti-Semite. And in some cases, they're probably right, but not in most. Not in most. When approached by a student who attacked Zionism, Martin Luther King responded, when people criticize Zionists, they mean Jews. You're talking anti-Semitism. In 2009, at least this one I have the year on, a columnist in the Kuwaiti daily newspaper stated, reading number 8, Judith, you're on for that one, reading number 8, 2009, Kuwaiti.
The conduct of the Israeli armed forces reflected, quote, an ancient ideology that is part of Jewish history and comes from the book they call the Talmud. One of the Psalms in the Talmud says, quote, as for their children, one must focus on killing them and on dashing them against the walls, pulverize their skulls until no trace is left of them, unquote.
Thank you. Martin, have you found this in the Talmud? I have not.
That's what I was going to ask you.
It is in the Psalms, though.
What's that?
It's in the Psalm. I mean, this dashing their skulls against rock, yeah, that's in a Psalm.
That the Jews would do this?
Yes, Psalm 126.
I'll take a look. Okay. Well, clearly no distinction is being made here between Jews and Zionists, but Zionists' behavior is being described as driven by Jewish law and history. More clearly stated, a Jordanian minister for social affairs in 69, he writes and declares, and this, Sandra, it's a sister act. You've got reading number 9.
Okay. All right, number 9. It is our firm belief that there is no difference at all between Jews and Zionists. All Jews are Zionists and all Zionists are Jews. And anyone who thinks otherwise is not thinking logically. We consider world Jewry our adversary and enemy.
All right.
Can't be more clear than that.
Yep. Despite all these resolutions, some progress towards peace in the Middle East took place in the 1970s. You know, Anwar Sadat flew to Israel, he meets with Begin, and you have the beginnings of peace of some sort. As a result, the support of the US, Sadat and Begin signed the peace treaty in 79, but it arouses fierce opposition not only in Arab nations, but in other Arab nations, but in Egypt as well. And Sadat is assassinated by the Muslim Brotherhood, the group to which he had belonged. We're gonna take a boat and going to Latin America. Okay. The worst record for anti-Semitism in the West during the 50s to 80s in South America was Argentina, where approximately 40,000 Jews lived. For generations there, the Jews were targeted for harassment and violence. Their synagogues were bombed, their cemeteries desecrated. In a country suffering economically and politically, the scapegoat was needed, and there could only be one. Legally, Jews were pegged as second-class citizens, and through the middle and though middle class, they were branded as purveyors of communism. Eva and Juan Perón's Argentina refused to allow European Jews to immigrate there during World War II, but Argentina became a haven thereafter for escaped Nazi war criminals. Such a government could hardly be expected to treat its Jews justly. In 2009, following public outcry concerning a prominent Catholic bishop who made statements denying the Holocaust government, the Argentinian government did expel him, but the official reason for doing so was a visa technicality. Another event in late 2018 involved a throng of soccer fans chanting an anti-Semitic slogan of killing Jews to make soap. We all get the reference. The fans went on to damage property, and police were called to ensure the safety of the players and the other spectators. And what was the root of this? It was the outcome of the soccer match in one team with Jewish roots won the game. Be careful what games you win. Let's look at the African American society here in America. In spite of the fact that there was strong Jewish participation in the civil rights movements of the 60s, the Black Power movement introduced considerable friction into Black-Jewish relations, especially when a native form of Islam attracted African Americans in search of an identity, while the Muslims were at war with the state of Israel. April 14th, 1970, the radical Black Power leader Stokely Carmichael declares, "I have never admired a white man, but the greatest of them was Hitler." In 1984, civil rights leader Jesse Jackson, I think most of you probably remember this, speaking to Washington Post reporter Milton Coleman, referred to Jews as Hymies and New York City as Hymietown. He later apologized. One of the principal sources of anxiety among American Jews was fueled in the late 93 and early 94 by statements made by Nation of Islam leader Louis Farrakhan. This is a piece of garbage.
Did you say 93 and 94?
Yes, yes. This all was exacerbated on November 29 of 93, when Farrakhan deputy Khalid Abdul Muhammad delivered an anti-white, anti-Catholic, homophobic, and virulently anti-Semitic address to an audience at Keene College in New Jersey. Most of us consider the Nation of Islam to be anti-Semitic. Specifically, the claim is that the Nation of Islam has engaged in revisionist and anti-Semitic interpretations of the Holocaust, and it exaggerates the role of Jews in the American slave trade. Their health minister, Abdul Ali Muhammad, has allegedly accused Jewish doctors of injecting blacks with the AIDS virus. The Nation of Islam has claimed that Jews were responsible for slavery. They're responsible for economic exploitation of black labor. They're responsible for selling alcohol and drugs in the black community. And they're responsible for an unfair domination of the economy. Judaism has been called a gutter religion. And in 1994, Farrakhan referred to Hitler as a genius. His aide, Abdul Muhammad, declared that Jews are bloodsuckers. You are called Goldstein, Silverstein, Rubenstein, because you've been stealing all the gold, silver, and rubies all over the world. Now, the Nation of Islam has repeatedly denied charges of anti-Semitism, and Farrakhan has stated, we're up to reading 11, I think, who has not read yet? Is everybody, Andrew, did you read? Okay, you've got it.
Uh,
Rona's box moved, and so it confused me.
The ADL used the term anti-Semitism to stifle all criticism of Zionism and the Zionist policies of the State of Israel, and also to stifle all legitimate criticism of the errant behavior of some Jewish people toward the non-Jewish population of the earth.
Okay.
Louis
So,
Farrakhan.
so let's look at some ADL statistics. According to the ADL surveys begun in 1964, African Americans are slightly more likely than whites to hold anti-Semitic beliefs. Although within that, there is a strong correlation between education level and the rejection of anti-Semitic stereotypes. Nonetheless, Black Americans of all education levels are nevertheless significantly more likely than whites to be anti-Semitic. 1998 survey, 34% of Blacks, nearly 4 times as likely as whites, 9%, fall into the most anti-Semitic category, on which at least 6 of 11 statements were potentially or clearly anti-Semitic. Among Blacks with no college education, 43% fall into that category. All right, and 20 Blacks, and 27% amongst the educated versus 18 and 5 among whites. I think I'm going to stop there. I'm going to stop there because I want to open up for discussion. There's so much we could get to. It's not like I'm going to cover it all. All right. So I just want to open up. We have a few minutes before it's the end of the class, and I want to open up not just on this week, but in general for the topic, whatever moves you, please. Martin, I see you've unmuted.
Well,
Go ahead.
just to clarify, it's at the end of Psalm 127, 137.
137. I know
Yeah,
that.
it's on the Al-Maharot Bavel ends with those statements.
You're right. You're right. But again, context.
Yeah.
They've just watched 1 million of their people murdered. This is like post-Holocaust people saying, expressing it. Yeah.
I'm just saying they're quoting it out of context, but those words are in Psalm 137.
Now that you give me the reference, I do remember it. Yep.
Right.
Thank you.
Bialik in one of his writings after the pogroms expressed something very similar to this that took place against the Jews in Soviet Union.
Okay. Judith?
2 things real fast, if anybody's interested. Louis Farrakhan, I thought he was dead, but then I started looking up stuff. I don't know who listens to him anymore, but 2 things. In the New York Times last October, there was an article which I didn't read. I don't know if it was about him or I think it was about Black women, but it was mentioned about his help, for Black women. And the chair of the ADL or the president or whomever wrote a response saying that talking about him without mentioning his long record of bigotry was not right. And that piece was really wonderful when it mentioned all of his, not all, but a list of his acts. Also, he called the vaccine for the COVID-19 a vial of death. So we got problems with him still. Yeah. The other thing is, if anybody is interested, you can see online I guess, in part of Chaim Herzog's speech as ambassador to the UN in '75, where he rips up the resolution. The picture's not very good, but you can hear him and it's subtitled in Hebrew.
Nice. All right. If there are no other questions, I want to, it's hard to say of a topic. Sandra, I see your hand. It's hard to refer to a topic like this and say it's been a delight, but nonetheless, despite the topic, it has been a delight being able to study with you and to learn from you as well. I mean, that's the pleasure of adult education, is the learning goes both ways. Indeed. Sandra, please.
Yeah, I want to say thank you so much for the course. Some of this I knew from Jewish history, but I think it just, it's just reinforced the idea that we are quite a tiny people that has just had incredible, unity to survive, right? And luck sometime. But, now I worry about, we should have a more modern course, maybe when you teach us American Jewry tomorrow, I mean, not tomorrow, next year, we'll talk about how we're dying off because of assimilation.
Yeah, so you beat me to it, because there's two competing factors that are playing here. When I taught the Melton course on Jewish history in general, and it finishes up with this whole concern for assimilation, one of the things I said was, somebody said to me, how do you fight that? And I said, I don't know the answer to that, but I do suspect that anti-Semitism is part of the way. Unfortunately, that's one of the tragedies, all right? But the reality of it is anti-Semitism is also forcing people to rethink whether or not it's worth being a Jew.
Right.
At the same time, people are having that conversation in their minds about assimilation. And so what the prospects, where we'll be in the year 2050, who knows? Who knows? But both factors are here at play in America today very strongly.
So I know there's a lot of seminars on the changing roles with Blacks that have, it seems to be, as Farrakhan seems to have lost influence in I know there's still some there, but it seems like it's improved, that relationships have, especially this last year.
Right. So I can't speak to that. I don't know.
No, it's a whole
I
other
want
topic.
to pray that you're right.
I hope we're right that that's.
Let's pray on that one.
Well,
Ted.
Kendra, I just want to thank you. We read the history books and we are told the Jews were welcome, they were thrown out, back and forth and on. And you've really given us insight as to why, rather than just it happened. And I thank you very much.
It's my pleasure. Economics. It's very dangerous to vote on economics. Judith.
I see if I'm going to unmute it. I don't know how this ties in, but I read something, I don't know if it was in the foreword, but it was an article about anti-Semitism. No, it was, and it was from Britain. Anti-Semitism not being grouped with the racism, but that it should be, but that the racism that we see, whether right now it's, Asian Americans, and of course, Black Americans and so forth. And I guess because we don't have a visible skin color or other things that would indicate that we're Jewish. I mean, some Jewish names, yes, but then there are,
So if you go, I have no doubt that if you go into the neo-Nazi and KKK groups, they've made the identification.
Oh yeah, but I'm saying in this article from someone in England was saying that Jews need to be identified as being subject to those same hate groups, but they often are sort of left out, and not just the hate groups, just the general, like you were saying from the ADL survey, you don't have to be a Proud Boy to be anti-Semitic. And, because Asian Americans and Black Americans and, all certain other races are easily identified, it's not as blatant. I don't know how to say
Not
it.
as visible on all levels.
Right, and that is a problem when we're fighting the white supremacists.
Right.
Mark, one of the things that strikes me is that obviously economics is an important factor, but after reading Constantine Sword, that book, the roots of Western anti-Semitism in the church are really significant in spite of Vatican II and so forth. And if you look at the people that I'm really afraid of in America, which are the white nationalists, not so much the left-wing anti-Semites, they're there, but I don't worry about them that much. Those are the people who adhere to, I mean, the shaman in the Congress said, I'm here in the name of Jesus, right? The guy stood up in the house, right, with that fancy uniform he had on. So those are the people scare me much more, because those are the people who tend to be violent, right? I mean, people can say a lot of things, but the people who want to kill us here in America are white nationalists.
In terms of violence, that's probably fair. Yep.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Cantor, for enhancing my knowledge
It's a
of
pleasure.
anti-Semitism, and I look forward to further offerings by you.
Let's keep playing. I love it. Thank
I
you.
have to head to another Zoom. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you very much. Enjoy.
Thank you, Cantor. I learned a lot.
And I too. Have a great day.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bill,
Bye.
be well. Bye.